Hello, everyone.
I will mute. Wait, this is.
Yeah, it was me. I was the one that was not muted there. Okay. Welcome to, I think this is our last language sciences talk of the term this year. Before we get started, I'd just like to acknowledge that we're on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I'm an uninvited settler living on the territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, Stalo, and Suminis nations. I know some of us are joining from other nations' territories this morning, and so I'd encourage you to learn more about these territories by visiting native-land.ca. As I mentioned, I'm a recent immigrant to Canada, relatively recent, and so I'm really grateful for the opportunities I've had to live, work, and learn on the Musqueam traditional territories. And as I prepare for my next step towards Canadian citizenship, I'm trying to reflect on how I can help further truth and reconciliation through my work in academia, as well as my civic life. So I'd invite you all to do the same. Next, I'd like to welcome Janet Worker, who's our co-director of language sciences, to introduce our invited speaker today, Dr. Darko Odic. Janet is University Killen Professor in the Department of Psychology, Director of the Infant Studies Center, and she's internationally recognized for her research investigating the perceptual foundations of language acquisition in both monolingual and bilingual learning. So, Janet.
And it's my pleasure to introduce Darko. So Darko Odic is a colleague of mine, a developmental psychologist in the Department of Psychology. And in his work, he looks at the foundations of really language and thought. And a lot of his work is on the role of numerical cognition in language and thought, and he'll be talking about some of that today. Darko did his undergraduate degree at University of Toronto. Yay! And then he did his PhD at Johns Hopkins. And as soon as he got there, he was just very interdisciplinary. So I guess your main advisor was Justin Halberta, but he collaborated so broadly with other faculty at thank you. No, I know that, but so in not just at his own university, but also the University of Maryland, College Park, and brings that same kind of interdisciplinary approach to all of his research. So I really value having Darko as a colleague. He's made some really important sort of contributions to how much language is in thought. But also come up with some really interesting sort of ways to characterize children's learning. I know that right now you have funding from both INSERC as well as the Jacobs Foundation, where you're relating your work on mathematical cognition to education. Yeah, so welcome.
Thanks, everyone. Is the mic working as far as we can tell? Okay. Is that better, everyone?
Let's get going. So I want to begin by noting, there we go, that as cognitive scientists and psychologists, we've made significant strides in understanding a lot about how different subcomponents of the mind work. We have amazing and excellent theories of the kinds of processes that underpin memory and attention and perception and action. And of course, a lot of work in psychology, neuroscience, et cetera, is also focused on the interactions between these, figuring out how these different systems communicate and correspond across each other to sort of solve the paradox of modular processing. But as language scientists, we then naturally ask, where does language fall in all of this? And some views, of course, treat language as just another modular system that has some interaction patterns with all of these other subsystems, but doesn't in any way take any primacy or extra importance in comparison to, for example, just straightforward interactions between memory and perception. But that's not the only theory in town. And the other way in which folks view language is as a much more central system, a system that plays a much more important role in characterizing how cognition is unified and how different subcomponents of the mind really interact together. So for example, famously, Peter Carruthers, Liz Spelke, and others have suggested that natural language might be the medium of intramodular integration, and that in the absence of language, different kinds of subsystems are not able to correspond and communicate to each other as well or at all in comparison to when we acquire language. So very famously, in a lot of the work that they cite, young children prior to the acquisition of language don't know how to integrate information about the geometry of a room with its color features, like the color of a wall. But once they acquire spatial language, these two different subsystems seem to suddenly be able to communicate with each other. More recently, and inspired especially by recent advances in things like Bayesian vision, there's been a different kind of proposal. And so it begins from the observation that a lot of our perceptual experiences that we have are inherently ambiguous, uncertain, and noisy. And so, for example, if you look at this image right here, it probably just looks like a bunch of black and white blobs and nothing more to it. But under the theory of folks like Gary Lupien, Larry Boroditsky, and others, language can play a very special role here. So we know from Bayesian vision that ambiguous information can be reconciled and interpreted if we have the right set of expectations. And then in those situations, we can integrate our expectations with the noisy information to come up at a coherent percept. And under their theory, language acts as a kind of automatic activator of those perceptual priors, those rich perceptual expectations that we have, in order to modify what they call the predictive cascades of perception and allow you to rapidly and efficiently add new percepts. So for example, looking at this image, it looks like black and white blobs, but maybe once I start telling you that this is actually an image of a woman in a cowboy hat kissing a horse, you might start, if you sort of start squinting, start to notice how different subcomponents like the face and the hat and the horse's head here start to come together. Now, in both of these views, language plays a really central role towards guiding the rest of cognition, perception, and action towards a set of unified goals and interactions. In today's talk, I'm going to give you a third possible answer here. And in some ways, it's going to disagree with the other two, but in some ways, it's going to have some overlap as well. I'm going to first express it as a pretty jargony way of it that I think is just very precise, and then we'll get more intuitive, and it will make a lot more sense once the talk is done. I'm going to suggest that language provides instructions for executing existing operations in modular systems. Now, again, that's a mouthful. If you don't understand what I'm talking about, I wouldn't be surprised. Let me make it a little bit more intuitive for now. And again, by the end of the talk, it will hopefully make a lot more sense. So what I'm going to argue today is that the role of language is to simply direct thought, not create, not revise, not allow for communication, not do anything automatically, but instead to provide a kind of set of instructions for how these operations and representations that exist in modular systems should combine and work together. And that's going to be especially useful when we need to override the default way in which these perceptual and memory systems work. Put differently, I'm going to argue that the way language interacts with the rest of cognition is by improving performance, not actually increasing competence, not allowing for new kinds of thoughts or anything like that. This, of course, is not in itself a new idea. People like Paul Petrosky have been arguing for something similar for a long time, but I'm going to provide some data that I hope is convincing for this. In my lab, we work on the question of how language interacts with many different systems. For example, we look at issues of confidence, metacognition, language and formal math, even sometimes cooperative behavior. But today I'm going to focus entirely on just one case study, and that's going to be the interaction between language and quantity perception for the purposes of the thesis I'm arguing. And again, if you want to know how the rest of this fits within that thesis, I'm happy to treat that in the Q&A. So what we're going to be doing today then is arguing the following. One, I'm going to, in the first part of the talk, show you that language does not automatically activate predictive cascades, specifically in number perception. So contrary to, for example, the kinds of theories that Gary Lupien has been proposing. Two, that language instead provides instructions for changing sortals or changing the default units in number perception. And in the third part, I'll show you how language provides instructions for quite complex comparison operations in number perception. One thing before I get into the experiments, you'll notice all of these are going to be involving specifically number perception. So before I show you the experiments that will go through this, let me tell you a little bit more about what number perception is and how we're going to be capturing it in today's work. So number perception is an ability for your perceptual system, in the absence of language or counting, to perceive and compare number. And I think the best way of explaining this concept is just to show it to you. So here are some objects on the left and the right, and you can immediately, without any issue, perceive that there are more things on the left than there are on the right. You can do that quickly, efficiently, and you can do that without counting. And in fact, it's not just you who can do this. Pre-verbal infants can do this. Members of cultures that lack number words or mathematical concepts in a formal sense entirely can do this, and even non-human primates can do this. So this is how we know that this system, this ability to perceive number, is something that exists independently of language. And in other work that I've spent a lot of time on that I'm not going to present today, we've also spent a long time demonstrating that number is a modular system distinct from the representations of other kinds of things like the size of the dots, their spread, etc. Now, in today's experiments, I'm almost always going to be using one specific type of number perception, and that's what we call number estimation. And I want to just give you a flavor for the kinds of things that our participants are going to be asked to do in all of the experiments I'm going to show you today. In just a moment, I'm going to flash some dots on the screen, and I just want you to yell out how many dots you think you saw. It's going to be too quick for you to count. You're just going to have to use your perception to do your best that you can. So let's give this a go. Everybody, how many dots are here? 4, no question. What about this one? Okay, somewhere between 10, 12, maybe 15. What about here? 35, I heard. So a couple of things here. First of all, these are all in the exact right ballpark. The first was 4, the second was 12 actually, and the third was 24. Okay, so you can do this, but it's not perfect. And there's differences both between people, and there's also, more importantly, differences between your guesses when I show you the same numbers multiple times. Small numbers are a little bit easier to estimate than large numbers, but you can do this. So in most of the tasks today, we're going to be giving people tasks like these, and we're going to be, as dependent variables of interest, going to be measuring 3 things. So just sort of commit these a little bit to memory for now. We're going to be measuring the slope of responses, which should ideally be 1. 1 means that every time I showed you 12, on average, you said 12. Every time I gave you 24, on average, you said 24. Variability is how variable your responses are across trials. So for example, I show you 24 dots 15 times. How variable are your estimates for that same number? And response time, how quickly can you respond? So this is going to be the basic framework for everything I show you today. And now, with that in mind, let's get going and talk about part 1. Language does not automatically activate predictive cascades in number perception. So the first thing that we want to talk about is the idea, and again, this is the central idea of folks like Gary Lupien and Darko Odic and Andy Clark, that language acts with the rest of cognition by automatically activating our perceptual and semantic expectations about the world, and therefore sort of navigates us towards particular ways of interpreting ambiguous information. So the first question we want to ask then is, well, do people have expectations about number at all? Do they have semantic and perceptual expectations for this? And it turns out that they do, and they're actually incredibly rich. So this here is a small subset of a large task that was published by Tom Griffiths and Josh Tenenbaum, in which they asked people to estimate, in the absence of any perceptual information, the number of, for example, the average lifespan of a person, the number of lines in a typical poem, etc. And what you can see on the bottom in the black line is the true answer, and the dots are participants' average estimates. So people have rich understandings of typical distributions of things like poems and lifespans, etc. More recently, work in computational modeling, including by people like Alberto Testolin and Steve Pianadosi, has really emphasized that our real life expectations are of usually interacting with small numbers. Okay, most of the time, the things that we experience in the world are in the like dozens, not in the hundreds or thousands. For why small numbers are represented so much more precisely than large numbers, exactly as you got to see in that estimation task. Okay, so we know these priors exist, but are they actually used in the context of a number estimation task? And I want to show you that intuitively, at least, there's good reasons to believe that they should. So for example, I'm not going to show you a stimulus, but let me ask you, imagine a stimulus of a dining room. How many dining chairs are in this stimulus? What do you think? 6? That's amazing. There's exactly 6, right? Because we have rich expectations about, it's probably 4, 6, maybe 8, etc. It's certainly unlikely to be 200. What about this? Oh, I'm sorry, I gave it away. How many ants in an ant colony? And you probably would guess at least several hundred, if not thousands, right? So again, we see that these semantic networks carried by words like dining room chairs and ants seem to carry information about numeric priors. But the problem is that in most of our research, we don't work with these kinds of stimuli. We ask people questions about things like dots, for which there are no expectations at all. And so in the first experiment, here's what I want to know. If we give people stimuli like these, and we ask them questions using words for which they should have some kind of prior, like how many umbrellas are there, does this demonstrate better performance? Because if there's an automatic activation of these priors, especially under intense time pressure that we're going to put participants under, you should do better when you're estimating things like umbrellas than you are with dots, given that, of course, we are using typical distributions of umbrellas, which we will. So experiment 1, 30 college adults, they're going to do a number estimation task. They're going to see scenes like these, not just umbrellas. They're going to see all kinds of other things, tomatoes, chairs, people in a mall, etc. And you may also be a little bit worried that, any difference between these kinds of stimuli may have to do with just like, well, real world objects tend to be more clustered together. Maybe there are low-level differences that could be responsible for this. So we also give participants a control condition where we are asking them about how many dots there are, but the dots are literally made up of the kinds of objects and their sizes and distributions that they would be in a real natural scene. So now the question is, do people do better when I ask them about umbrellas in comparison to dots in either one of these cases? And it turns out they do not. So this is accuracy, that slope variable. 1 is perfect performance. This is how well people do in the red when they're asked about artificial displays, how many dots, how well they do for those natural dots when I ask you about dots, and how well they do for real life scenes. And we actually see an impairment. People are actually worse under intense time pressure to estimate scenes with real objects in comparison to these other 2. And they also turn out to be noisier, so variability is also higher, therefore worse. Of course, you may be wondering, okay, that's nice, but look, scenes are complicated for all kinds of reasons. People need to spend time to find these things, right? It may not be immediately obvious, like what counts as an umbrella in this scene. And so in the second experiment, you can think about it as a control experiment, we're going to change our scenes, and we're going to make the objects substantially more salient. So now we have, for example, a bundle of tomatoes where you just see the tomatoes, nothing else, or tomatoes in a faded background scene. Again, we're going to do this under intense time pressure. You only have half a second to see the scene. Does your knowledge of a typical distribution of how many tomatoes you get to see at a grocery store help you with something like this? And we once again find that it does not. So even when we're really trying to help people out in situations like these, we find that performance is worse in these scenes with real world objects, and it is more variable as well. The performance is a little better. We certainly help them a little bit by changing these scenes, but it does not help them as much as it should. Now, we have all kinds of other control experiments if you're curious about, like other kinds of controls like occlusion and things like that, other kinds of tasks like number comparison rather than estimation. But I can tell you, no matter how we slice and dice it, we always perpetually fail to find any advantage and often find a pretty pronounced cost when we are estimating number in these real world scenes. So I'm going to use that as a momentary conclusion. And again, we can talk more about these findings in Q&A to say that language does not appear to activate predictive cascades, at least not automatically. Or at least if it does, it doesn't provide any benefit that we would expect under this theory. In ongoing work, we have work going on, for example, where we're doing number estimation with what we call pure priors, kind of like that dining room and ants example, where we give you no perceptual information to just really figure out like the exact quality of the priors. We're looking at how different kinds of priors, including for low numbers, emerge over development as children are actually learning more about their world. And in future work, we're especially interested in doing number estimation in what we call unnatural environments, environments in which we really start to skew the actual distributions in order to see whether we can harm performance or not as we start to change those as well. So that's it for the first part. And just in the interest of time, I'm going to keep going and ask everybody to save questions until the end. But I'm very, very happy to discuss this a lot more. That's a kind of negative evidence, right? Negative evidence that language doesn't seem to do very much or not as much as it should given a theory. But what's the positive evidence for this idea that language directs thought, or that language provides instructions for the execution of existing operations in modular systems? So I'm going to show you what I mean by this in the second part now, where I'll tell you how language provides instructions for changing sortals in number perception. So what's a sortal? For those of you who are not familiar with the term, that is effectively the unit of enumeration. Check out a scene like this. Perhaps the most natural sortal in a scene like this is me asking you how many trees are there. But of course, it doesn't need to be that way. I could ask you about how many branches there are, how many leaves there are, all kinds of other questions as well. These are situations in which we're changing the units of enumeration. We're changing the sortals. And so the question then becomes, when it comes to perception and perception alone, what are the sortals of number perception? Are there any, what we might call default units, ways in which perception tends to treat the world and enumerate objects by default? And it turns out, yeah, there is such a thing. The default sortal for perception is a segmented object. What we mean by that is that when, for example, we give your visual system a set of, let's say, 4 objects that are disconnected like this, your vision, and we can do this, for example, through neural firing, examining the neurons that typically respond to 4. How do they respond to this image? They treat it as 4. But if we connect them, making it like this, suddenly this is represented as a number 2. Okay, and so segmented objects are the default units of perception. This is in fact such a strong effect that you can sometimes impair people's performance with it. If you give people stimuli like these, in which you can see in these blues that the stimuli are fitting together, but they're not actually connected, people still will be sort of fooled by that, and their perceptual system will estimate this blue stimulus as 3 as opposed to 5. And so even in situations where we ask people to enumerate objects, the visual system can't but treat the default unit as one segmented object. So the question is, can language change that? I'm going to give you an intuition again that it maybe can. So imagine that I show you this set of 3 dots and I tell you, hey, everybody, I'm going to teach you something new today. This is one tone. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to show you a bunch of dots on the right side. And I just want you as quickly as possible to tell me, how many tomas do you see? Here we go. How many tomas does everyone see? 4. I'm hearing some 4s, maybe some 5s, etc. Right? So in this situation, what I'm asking you to do is treat 3 separable segmented objects as one. I'm effectively asking you to do a process of division, right? There's actually 12 objects here, so 12 by 3 is 4. Now, here's the thing. You may be able to do this. And that might be like, okay, great. I maybe have just shown you that I can use language to change this default unit. But then again, maybe not. Maybe perception still just sees this as 10 or 12 or something like that. And then you sort of afterwards being the smart adult that you are, go, oh, I need to divide by 3. That's what the researcher wants me to do. Okay, I saw 12. I'm convinced it's 12, but sure, I can play your game. I'll divide 12 by 3 and just tell you 4. Okay. In that situation, language didn't really change very much. It just allowed you to do something post-decisional instead of changing anything in terms of how number is perceiving these objects. So if we really want to demonstrate this, we need to alleviate the ability for you to do that kind of division trick. How are we going to do that? We're going to test kids who don't know how to divide, kids who have not been taught any formal division, and kids who are actually quite immature even in their ability to do number estimation at all. It's going to be with 45 kids between the ages of 5 and 8. I can tell you from the general BC curriculum, they've not yet been taught how to do a formal division in school. I will also show you data across different ages in case you're worried about the older kids. They're going to do a number estimation task in 3 conditions in which the unit is going to be 1 dot, 3 dots, or 5 dots. So we're going to, for example, tell them that 1 dot is called a blicket, and they're going to estimate how many blickets do you see. We're going to teach them that 3 dots is called a toma, 1 toma, and then they're going to estimate how many they see, how many tomas they see. And we're going to teach them that 5 dots is called a modi, and we're going to ask them how many modis they see. Okay. So the question is, can that simple instruction change the perception of number? And it turns out that it can. What I'm showing you here is the median estimate across the different numbers. These are quotients, so these are the actual answers. So for example, when I'm showing you 5 dots at 22, that's actually 5 times 22 dots. So we're really showing them a lot more dots. For example, and 15 and 3, that's for example 15 dots, etc. These X's are where their performance should be if they're doing the task correctly. And what you can tell is that across all of these, they're completely overlapped. There is no significant dots are, and when we're doing 3 tomas, are 5 tomas, as they are that 110 or something like that are 22 blickets. And again, you might be wondering, well, okay, this is probably more convincing because we have some evidence that they're unlikely to be doing this through some kind of a division trick. But maybe you're worried that this is all led by just the oldest kids in the group. So here I'm just going to show you the 3 dot and the 5 dot condition for the 5s, 6s, and 7s. So now these lines these are all the 3 dot conditions. The different colors are the 5, 6, and 7s grouped separately, and the 5s. You can see there are no age-related effects. 5-year-olds can do this as well as anybody else. So what we believe from this experiment, and we do have some follow-ups that I'm happy to talk about again, is that language can override the default perceptual sortal and number perception even before formal division. We have a lot of follow-up work going on this line. One thing you might be wondering is, does it work in reverse? Can we break a sortal? Can we take, for example, a single dot, teach kids that a half dot is called a blicket, and have them treat groups of single objects as multiples? So we have some work going on with that right now. One other thing that we've been working on a lot is whether language can provide a sortal for non-numeric dimensions. For example, when you're measuring how many centimeters long a line is, you're effectively taking a unit, a centimeter, and doing it as a kind of iterative procedure. And so we're interested in how language is used to guide these kinds of intuitions, again, well before kids ever enter school and learn these things there. And finally, we're also interested in how these effects work in extremely early perception. So one way in which we can do this is through adaptation effects. So we can, for example, examine whether if I give people, let's say 100 dots, but tell them that they're looking at blickets, groups of 3, let's say, do they actually adapt as if I am showing them 100 dots, or are they adapting as if I am showing them close to 30 dots? And so that way we can really start to eliminate some of these effects and start to pinpoint whether the effects are occurring even in early vision. Okay, so let me go through the third. How am I doing for time? I'm doing okay for time. So we're going to do the final part right now. So in part 3, I'm going to give you another sort of positive spin at the central thesis, and that is that language can provide distinct instructions for comparison operations in ways that are very nuanced and maybe even surprising, and reveal certain capabilities for our modular perceptual systems that we didn't even know existed before understanding the role of language in this way. So first of all, let's talk about the main thing we're going to be talking about today, and that is quantifiers. Words like more, words like most, superlatives as well in a little bit, etc. So these are words like these. So imagine, for example, that imagine a scene in which there are, let's say, 12 yellow or 12 blue dots let's say 6 yellow dots. And suppose imagining that scene that I ask you whether there are more blue than yellow dots. The answer is yes. And are most of the dots blue? The answer is again, yes, right? From the perspective of simple truth conditions, these are identical sentences given a scene of 12 blues and 6 yellows. But of course, the underlying semantics here are distinct if we really think about it as a set of instructions for how thought ought to be operating to find out if this is true or false. Namely, in the case of more, we're really dealing with a set-set comparison. What you ideally want to be doing is you want to enumerate the number of blue dots, then enumerate the number of yellow dots, and then compare those numbers. Straightforward. On the other hand, most is a word that is actually about set-subset comparison. And so what you want to do here is enumerate all the dots, then enumerate the blue subset and check if more than 50% of dots are blue. And if you need more like convincing here, notice that in a scene where there are blue, yellow, purple, red dots, I can still use the sentence most of the dots are blue because it doesn't matter how many other colors there are. It just matters that there are dots and some of them are blue. Whereas in the case if there are more blue than yellow, if there's also purples and reds, etc., those are irrelevant or otherwise need to be specified in the question for you to treat them as relevant. So what this leads to is a kind of interesting prediction. If these are true instructional differences, if the meanings of these sentences lead to distinct instructions in the rest of thought, then we can create stimuli that make this process easier, and you should be able to do better with the more question, and we can create stimuli that are more consistent with this process, and you should do better on this one. And that's exactly what we can do, for example, by creating stimuli like these, in which we really segment the sets apart such that you are literally like, okay, bunch of blues, great, I got them, bunch of yellows, great, I got them, now compare, as opposed to this, where we make the finding of all the dots in the superset really nice and easy. And so you can do the operation of enumerating all the dots first and much more quickly. So in the next series of experiments, I'm going to show you how people have actual real preferences for these kinds of stimuli given these kinds of sentences, even though from the perspective of number perception alone, the numbers are the same in these displays. And from the perspective of mere truth conditions, these two sentences are exactly the same. So I'm going to show you first an experiment in which we literally just asked people for their preferences. We got 96 native English speakers, and we showed them those two images and asked them which one of these two images is a better example of there are more blue than yellow dots or most of the dots are blue. Importantly, this was between subject. You don't know that the other sentence exists. So you can't do some kind of like pragmatic comparison in order to like lead you to preferring one over the other. So I'm going to show you data like this, preference for most, depending on when they were given the most condition. We find that 65% of people say that this is a better example of most of the dots are blue. And when they're given the more condition, 75% of people say that this is a better example of there are more blue dots than yellow dots. Okay, funky little effect. Can we push it further? Maybe this is some kind of a pragmatic thing. Maybe they're just interpreting us and being like, I kind of see what you're doing here. Let's let them make the displays. We recruit 200 native English speakers. We give them an iPad and we ask them to make a visual scene corresponding to either there are more blue dots than yellow dots or most of the dots are blue. They take that iPad and they start touching it, and they can make as many blue dots and as many yellow dots as they want wherever they want. What do they create? Well, in the case of there are more blue dots than yellow dots, they create this, a display in which the centroid, the distance between the center of mass between these is quite far apart. And in the case of asking them for most of the dots are blue, they make it almost entirely overlap. So even when we let them make us the scenes, it is consistent with the results that I just showed you. Finally, you might ask, okay, this is all fine, but like, does it actually make a difference for how people perform on number tasks? So in the last task, we're going to do a number comparison task. I'm going to show you images like these, and I'm going to ask you between subject whether there are either most of the dots are blue, true or false on every trial, or there are more blue or yellow dots on every single trial. And what we can see is that there is a slight benefit for the more condition. This is not a huge effect, but it is a reliable and subtle but real effect where people are doing better on the more condition when they are spatially separated as opposed to the most condition, even though, again, from the perspective of the actual numbers and truth conditions, these are identical. So this is the idea. These kinds of sentences are providing distinct instructions, allowing the number system to recombine information in different kinds of ways that can lead to subtle and meaningful differences in behavior. Finally, I want to ask, well, okay, but what happens when we don't know the actual meaning of the actual instructions, of a particular sentence? And the place where we've explored this a lot is in the domain of superlatives, words like the most or longest. So consider a scene like these, like this one right here. You need to verify whether the red line is the longest line. Now, you can all, having looked at the scene, eventually ascertain, yes, it is. But how do you do this? What are the kinds of instructions that we might propose here? Well, one way of doing this is the intuitive one. It's going to be a series of successive comparisons. What you're going to be doing is presumably you're going to find the red line and you're going to measure its length. Then you're going to have to pick another line. Maybe you pick the blue line and you then measure its length. You compare the length of blue to yellow. And if red wins, then you're like, okay, it's longer than blue. Then you need to find the next line in order. And this is a recursive process that I need to keep going through until I've compared red to every other line, and therefore I know it is the longest. Now, given typical time constraints, memory problems, and all kinds of other perceptual noise issues, this process is faulty. It should lead to be very hard. People should really struggle to find the longest line, or the shortest as well, by the way, and it should be strongly dependent on the number of lines that exist on the stimulus. As we increase more and more lines, it means more and more comparisons. You should do pretty badly. On the other hand, however, this isn't the only possible set of instructions. Because when we, for example, examine how different kinds of computers and machines do this process, it turns out that if your data is structured and pre-sorted, in other words, if quantities like lengths in a computer are represented in a structured format such that they are sort of represented in, if you will, a number line, then all you need to do is you need to use a kind of max operator. Your line perception might work like this instead. What might be the case is the moment I see all of these lines, I have all of their lengths represented on a kind of internal length line. And all I need to do is I need to figure out, well, the one that is the highest on my representational scale, is that one red? And I don't need to do anything else. In this situation, this should be really fast, should be really efficient, and it should not matter how many lines I am showing. So which one of these we're going to do just this. We're going to present people with 5 lines in this experiment. I'll show you more subsequently. And you need to find the X line. X is sometimes longest, second longest, third longest, fourth longest, or shortest line. You see the question, the lines appear for just a second, and then you need to click on the color of the line that was that particular one in sequence. We're going to measure your accuracy and response time. And again, if you're following that sort of serial process, we should find ultimately that you're going to be pretty bad, because successively comparing 5 lines within a second is an extremely laborious challenge. Instead, what we find is that people are tremendously good at finding the longest line and the shortest line. These different colored lines are the percent difference, how close in length they are. And so, of course, the more close in length the lines are, the harder the task is. When the longest and the second longest only differ by 5%, it's harder. But you can see at every level of difference, people are doing very well at finding the longest and the shortest lines. And ultimately, if anything, it looks like the process is serial comparison from them, right? And we can further demonstrate that by looking at response times, which are inverted. People are very fast to find the longest and the shortest, and then there's this serial drop-off as they're going towards the middle. So it seems like maybe what we're dealing with here is people are very efficient at finding these endpoints of lines. They can use a kind of max and min operator, and then afterwards go into the middle from there. What happens then when we show them 7 lines? Now we're increasing. We should substantially impair performance if you're serially comparing, but if you're using a max operator, it doesn't really matter how many lines I'm showing you. And here is the data for 7. And what I want to show you, I can sort of flip back and forth. Notice that the performance here is identical. There are no differences in how good you are at finding the longest and shortest line out of 5 or out of 7. okay? And same for RT, you're equally fast as well. So once again, we find this cannot be serial comparison then. The instruction set is simply not that. And it's not that because we would at least find a significant cost as we increase the number of lines. This also suggests, by the way, that it's not some kind of a partial sort as opposed to a full sort, because even a partial sort would require more comparisons for 7 than 5. Finally, you might be wondering, okay, but is this just something weird about lines? Maybe there's a way to cheat this process because we're dealing with a bunch of lines. So in experiment 4C, we're doing it with number. And we literally put as many dots as we actually can on the screen. We just cannot go any further than this. So we put dots into different sets, 5 different sets here. And we're asking them which team painted the most dots, the second most dots, the third most dots, etc. And what do? We get a replication of the finding. So even in the case of number, where the ability to, whatever theory you might have on how they might cheat with lines, they're not doing it. And RT, again, inverted. So, keeping in mind that I'm about to get a time warning, I am going to summarize and open it up for questions. So what I've shown you today is 3 things. 1, that language does not appear to automatically activate predictive cascades in the case of number perception. And I've shown you that by showing you that number perception is not better with real-world objects and nouns that should be carrying these predictive priors. I've shown you that language provides instructions for changing sortals in number perception. And I showed you this by showing you that language can change the default object for number perception, even in young children. And I've shown you that language can provide distinct instructions for comparison operations. So for example, more versus most carry subtly different but behaviorally meaningful differences in how people approach and create stimuli. But also, we can do something different with this as well. We can find that the kinds of instructions that superlatives seem to provide reveal an existence of something like a max-min operator in number perception, which prior to this, we didn't even know really truly existed. So to sum up then, again, and I hope now this makes a lot more sense, the theory that I'm proposing is that language is not acting as an integrator across modules, and it doesn't seem to be acting as an automatic activator of predictive cascades as well. It is instead providing instructions for how these different modular systems, in this case quantity perception, might execute operations that already exist within them, but can do so by changing how they do it by default or making very small and subtle changes in order to lead to meaningful behavioral effects. And again, this is just part of a broader project that we're working on in the lab beyond quantity perception as well. And so if you have any questions about how I think this theory fits more broadly within things like metacognition, formal math, and even a little bit on cooperative behavior, I'm really happy to talk about that as well. With that, I'll end. I'll thank all of my incredible collaborators, the granting agencies, and all of you for your time as well. Thanks.
Really interesting. Yeah, so I've heard some of this, but I always learn. Thinking about it differently now, so thank you. But I kind of want to challenge your natural scenes in your first experiment.
Sure.
And I know you just gave one example, but I see tomatoes displayed at the grocery store. I get little boxes of cherry tomatoes. I put tomatoes away in a bowl.
You eat single tomatoes.
I eat single tomatoes.
Yep.
I cook with maybe X number. So which of those is my natural scene? And how do you do that?
Great question. And so I think here what we can really refer back to, I don't know how to, not my computer, so I'm not going to slide back. But if we recall back to, for example, the work by Griffiths and Tenenbaum, priors are not for single numbers. They're for distributional information. And in situations where we have noisy information, it's going to be that we probably take the mean of that. And so I completely agree. The distributional information for tomatoes is probably somewhere between 1 and maybe, 2 dozen or something like that would probably be if I sort of reflect on my prior. And so it's never going to be just a single number. But the point is that there is still information there that is useful because for example, well, I can certainly exclude 5,000. I can certainly exclude, those numbers. And it should lead to at least a marginal improvement. A prior plus a likelihood is always better than a pure likelihood, if you will. And as a result of that, I think that we should expect that for some kinds of objects we gave, maybe there are tighter priors. There's, I think, certainly tighter priors for dining room chairs than there are for tomatoes. We did look at that. And so we examined, for example, the different subsets of things, the different objects that we gave. Was there an advantage for one thing? There wasn't. And so performance was pretty equivalent across these different things. There are some differences, like when we're showing people images where there's a lot more numbers. Of course, they're more variable on those just because the numbers are higher. But even when we control for that, we don't find an effect of specific nouns. Now, at the same time, challenge accepted in a sense that maybe we just didn't make it hard enough. Maybe there are still subtle effects to be revealed in there, which is why that work with the pure priors is, I think, going to be very important, because it's going to give us a real sense of, well, what do people think is a typical distribution of tomatoes, just like in the dining room chair. And so that work is still pending. And so, but that's how I think we'll handle it. But ultimately, I think that even given the work that we have right now, we should have found some advantage from the distributional information, and we don't, though I grant that maybe we didn't push participants hard enough.
Hello. So I was more thinking about like the differentiation between more and most. Like, let's say we apply it in like a university setting.
Yep.
Like, would it like be easier for us to perceive that concept of most? Let's say most university students wear glasses, which probably not true, but like when you think about it and then you're in the environment, you start looking around, maybe you start noticing it. But then let's say you're comparing yourself to a separate group. Let's say you're comparing yourself in a university setting, because I'm a university student, but like some other people are like high school students. Like, let's say you're comparing across like conditions, then if you use the word more, like let's say more people wear glasses, then like would it be easier to perceive it that way?
Yeah, so I think that's a wonderful question. So what I'm imagining, and you can tell me if I'm misunderstanding, I imagine a context in which I'm judging whether more people wear glasses in high school than university, as opposed to most people in university wear glasses or most people in high school wear glasses. Is that the kind of condition? Okay, wonderful. So I think that, what's important here, so if we're doing it without any perceptual information at all, which we can do, we can just, interrogate our semantic networks, then obviously I don't think that there's going to be a difference in how those questions are manifesting in behavior. This is really about the interaction between how am I structuring the perceptual information and how I am giving the linguistic cues. Now, that being said, can I imagine situations in which we might be able to subtly influence behavior by, maybe even appealing to like most's tendency towards enumerating an entire set and like playing with some notions of in groups and out groups or something like that, where maybe some groups are easier to enumerate or be like, yes, all of these people belong to the same set that I'm considering. I could imagine that. We, of course, don't have any data for that. And it would need to be, even these effects with perceptual things are quite subtle. And so I think it's possible. I don't want to say that they're not, though I would say that in terms of practical application, the effects are pretty small. And maybe there are contexts in which they would be bigger, but we haven't explored that. But yeah, I think a lovely suggestion.
Yeah, I'm just wondering because like I would like imagine, let's say you have a participant go into two groups of people and they start counting like characteristics.
Yeah.
Like let's say like the participant here is like he's completely from a different group, and then he goes to one location, let's say group A, and then he goes to another location which is group B. So like that's clearly like two separate ones.
Yeah.
So like in that sense, like maybe the word more will like kind of like bring out the differences between the groups.
Such things. I will note one important confound, and that is that pragmatically, people do tend to prefer using the word most when we're dealing with a substantial majority, right, rather than a strict majority. And so that's been something that we've really struggled with, because we want to make sure that people are treating most as, from a strict truth conditional perspective, it's just like more than 50%. But pragmatically, most people would say that most is more like, you should really only be using that when it's like 65% or something like that, right?
Yeah, we even say,
and so we always have to be very careful of those effects, but those framing effects absolutely exist, but that's about a different matter altogether, right? But the previous work has shown already that most versus more differentiates a little bit in that sort of like, where is the criteria for minimums, though it seems to be primarily a pragmatic effect. And so as long as we can control that, I think we can definitely play with these kinds of effects in interesting ways.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yes, thank you. This is very interesting. I was wondering if you have any thought or what your thoughts are on the distinction between mass nouns and count nouns. So this is about the sortals.
Yep.
And then whether about possible cross-linguistic differences. For instance, in classifier languages, often claim that all nouns are mass nouns. And so what sort of effect might this have on these kinds of tasks?
So I wrote my dissertation on mass nouns versus count nouns. So I have lots of thoughts on this. The short answer is that the way that that I tend to think about what count nouns are that they are a invitation towards counting and segmenting. And so, for example, I think a lot about situations in which I can show you the exact same stimulus and I can ask you how many cows versus how much beef. That's an interesting thing about breaking sortals, right? Because in a case, imagine that I have like 10 cows on the screen, but they're in different sizes or something like that. Conceivably, when I'm asking you how much beef or which side has more beef or something like that, I'm specifically telling you, don't attend to the brood number, like attend to the size of them. And we find those kinds of effects all the time, right? And so absolutely, the count nouns versus mass nouns, count nouns seem to be providing instruction specifically to number-based stuff and mass nouns to not. Now, the cross-linguistic difference is really, really interesting. We've been doing a little bit of work, but it's still, because of COVID, unfortunately, like we really got and had to suspend all of this about how people from classifier versus non-classifier languages approach ambiguous scenes that could be either interpreted using number or using cumulative area in the absence of language, and then as we started giving them language. So for example, if I'm just showing you a scene with a bunch of dots and I'm not giving you any verbal description, what is the default parse, if you will? Are they primarily thinking about number or are they primarily thinking about area? We can do that, for example, with eye tracking. People tend to look at a scene differently when they are processing number as opposed to non-numeric cues. And so we wanted to do this with speakers of classifier languages, bilingual, but also ideally at some point monolingual as well. All of that work got terminated by COVID because we needed to do it with eye tracking. And so work pending, I'd love to be able to give you a better answer at the cross-linguistic difference, I'm sorry, in a year or two when we finally get around to finishing that project.
Great, thanks.
Thanks for the great talk. So I have a really nebulous kind of question that hopefully I can articulate in a way that is kind of at least interesting to engage with. And it's coming from the really annoying perspective of I have small children. And so thinking about how when kids have language, and I kind of almost mean like language in quotes, because they have like the phonological form. They know that this word exists, but they have no idea what the word means.
Yeah.
And so that language is there before that concept or thought is actually there. And as the case in point, I was, my daughters are almost exactly 3 years apart. And so I was looking at my 4.5-year-old daughter 3 years from now, and she was able to count to 10. Did she have any idea what those numbers meant beyond like 1 and 2? No, but she knew that those were numerical entities of some sort that she could anticipate learning about eventually, right? So what does it mean that language is instruction for thought before the thoughts actually exist when the language is there?
Love that question. Not nebulous at all.
Okay.
I think like deeply interesting and something I do think about a lot as well. So the first thing, your intuitions about your daughters are actually empirically correct. We know that kids have sort of placeholder words. I mean, adults actually probably we do as well. There's lots of words that we kind of know the gist of, but don't actually
like
know
the
the
book
meaning.
And you're like,
of.
okay, I'll look that up later. I'll pretend I know.
Yeah, exactly. And kids are first learn the number words and they have nothing for it except the sequence. Then they start enriching it and they start to understand that it carries some kind of notion of quantity, but not necessarily number. And it takes a very long time. And it's a very slow sequential process as they start learning the meanings of 1 and 2, then 3, then 4. And it's much later that they really sort of generalize and understand the logic of counting. So the question here, I think, is very nicely expressed in the domain of kids, but it's also, I think, very well expressed in the domain of adults as well for all of these words that we don't know the exact meaning to. And so here, I want to say that the way that I think about it is twofold. One is that some of this is resolved in my own work by the fact that we don't typically look at the meanings of nouns, and which tend to be much more nebulous to sort of define their meanings. Most of the stuff that I'm working on here are sort of logical vocabulary comparisons and things like that, which kids really do seem to master very quickly, and which we have good reason to believe exist in a sort of, pre-verbal form as well. And so a lot of the time, the work that I'm working on sort of avoids that because we're sort of really focused on the logical vocabulary. But what happens when we start really asking about things like nouns and number words, et cetera? I've been really influenced by some of the recent proposals in philosophy of language that sort of suggest that the way we should think about meanings of words is as pointers towards clusters of thought. And so this is Colty Dunn published a recent paper that I think is really phenomenal on this topic. I think it was published in Brain and Behavioral Sciences, or it's maybe about to be, in which the idea is that words don't have precise reference in a way that maybe we would, in some more classic philosophy and psychology think about, but instead are really pointing towards a group of concepts. Now, what that would imply is that the instructions are not sufficient. It would imply that, like, I'm pointing in this general direction, and that's the best the instruction can do. And then what you have to do after that is you have to use non-verbal means, including perhaps pragmatic reasoning, to infer what is it within this space that I'm supposed to think. And I think that a lot of the time, so in a maybe a bit of a meta way, I gave you that really, really jargony thing at the beginning of the talk, language provides instructions for us, blah, blah. And like, I think for many people, they're like, okay, like, I don't really understand what that means, but like, I know what some of those individual words mean, but it pointed you in some direction. It was like very loose. And hopefully then, I could have, through better language, subpointed to subcomponents of where I thought the pointer was in order to construct a more precise thought, or I could have left it vague and you would have been left with like, I only have a very general understanding of what I'm supposed to be doing here. And so instructions ultimately, I think, are not the kinds of things like where you have to commit to just one thing. They can point towards a space. And in that space, you're going to have to use all kinds of non-linguistic things in a way that we non-verbally communicate to point each other towards particular things as well.
Yeah.
So that's how I think about it.
So that's really interesting. And it actually aligns somewhat with an interview I heard from Jeff Hinton recently, where he said he thought Chomsky was wrong about what words are. And it's because he's pointing to this exact same kind of thing, that it's like this network of connected things that get you at that meaning as opposed to it having core meaning.
And though I will say, I would reserve that exclusively for things like nouns and maybe verbs and adjectives, not things like the logical vocabulary. I think the logical vocabulary provides pretty clear instructions, which is also why I think it's been so easier, let's say, to work in this space with these kinds of tasks than in the case of something like that.
But if the logical words, this is the last thing I'll say before I pass the mic to someone else, if they provide really clear instructions, then why would most be so hard to get people to actually have most mean most?
As in strictly more than 50%?
Yeah,
I think that because we don't only use language for the instructions that we're given, right? And language is part of what directs our thoughts, but it's certainly not the only thing. And so that's the way in which I tend to think about semantics versus pragmatics, is that, we are trying to read intentions of people, and those are going to be sort of directing us towards particular things. You and I could certainly communicate about a whole lot of things without using language. Language is not the only thing that directs thoughts. And sometimes I'm going to have to integrate and cross-integrate across. So, yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I have a broad and narrow follow-up question. First of all, hi, good to see you.
Hey.
So you kind of anticipated the question I was going to ask when you brought up the philosophy of language pointers question, but I wanted to push you to more clearly define what you mean by language. And the narrow question is, in the first section, I couldn't find where the language priming actually was, and maybe I just missed it, or maybe this is just a naive question because this is really outside my realm. But just by showing a picture of a tomato or umbrellas or whatever, like, are we actually activating language in doing so, or are we just activating the semantic concept of a tomato? Right. So like, you have the lexicon and then you have the concept, and maybe the lexicon is actually a probability distribution of pointers. Where actually is language coming into play in that particular scenario? And then the broader question is, what are we talking about when we're talking
Precisely.
about the
All right.
role of language?
Wonderful. And sorry that this wasn't clear. I had a demo and I cut it and I'm realizing I shouldn't have. The task works the following way. You see the question, how many tomatoes? The question disappears and I show you
Okay,
the
so
scene.
it is actually there. In
It
the
is
framing.
actually
Okay,
there.
that
It's very
explains that.
similar. And again, I
Yeah.
should have made this very clear to some of the examples I showed you before.
Yeah, and I had a similar question a reaction to Janet's, which was, what is the nature of the tomatoes?
Yeah.
And I felt that you actually addressed that really nicely by using the specific, like the grocery store scene, because my immediate thought was like, well, in my garden, I have many, many tomatoes, but on my plate, I have 2, right?
Yes.
So by actually putting it into providing more of that pragmatic context, you're actually updating the person's priors from the initial question of tomatoes.
So that's great. We also thought that the scene context would help a lot, which is why we actually predicted that when we fade the background, you should be better than when we remove it entirely. But people weren't. And so it does seem like, to the extent that that kind of priming is happening, it's not pushing their performance very much, because even when I remove the background context, it just looks like a pile of tomatoes. It's not improving performance as opposed to when it's tomatoes very clearly in a grocery store. But I think that's another just like small subset of the data that is interesting there. Now, to the bigger question. In some ways, this is maybe a bit of a cop-out answer, but like, I think that language is what linguists study. And I am, for the most part, happy to defer to those kinds of things. I will say this. Everything that I'm talking about has to do with the process of language being externalized and interpreted by the subject. I don't have much to say about what is happening when you are thinking purely internally in linguistic thoughts. I have no idea, for example, whether when we're thinking about things, if we are self-directing our thoughts. I don't know, maybe not. I don't know whether, spontaneous combinations of thoughts are what is then feeding back and just triggering a linguistic redescription of them. I can't even precisely tell you how the process goes in reverse. I want to communicate to you a particular set of instructions because I've just witnessed something. How do I translate those instructions into language? I don't know, but I will say, so as far as I'm willing to say for the data that I showed you today, we're really dealing with sort of like receptive, external, communicative aspects of language rather than the purely internal ones. And, if I'm really pushed on what do I mean by language, I defer and say the stuff that linguists study.
All right, so it's basically our problem now.
Thanks, I appreciate you solving it.
Sorry.
I know it's past 1. I don't know if we have to call it, but. Sure.
I just wanted to build on to what she was saying, because like when she was talking about kind of like internally the head and stuff like that, I was thinking of like imagery memory. So like, let's say like I went to a supermarket and then like I remember seeing like maybe all the tomatoes sold out or maybe a lot of tomatoes in packages like inside the shelves. Like I don't think I'll remember that in terms of language at all. Like instead it would kind of just be like a blurred image in my head.
Yeah.
So I believe like maybe that will play a part in the sense of like maybe I would count it differently and like word might not influence how I count and stuff like that.
Yeah, so let me make this very clear by sort of referring to the kinds of examples that people who subscribe to this theory would say. The point is not that language is encoding expectations. Expectations are in semantic networks that happen through experience. They may be through visual experience, auditory information, maybe the stuff that you've read, etc. And those things are non-linguistic. What language ought to be doing, according to the theory of folks like Gary Lupian, etc., is that the meaning of a word is fundamentally activating that semantic network or that perceptual experience. If I say a woman with a cowboy hat, it is like the idea in this theory is that it's literally activating regions in your mid-level perceptual experiences of like women in cowboy hats, and you sort of like have that image, and that acts as an expectation to reconfigure the incoming ambiguous information. But ultimately, of course, we could do that without language as well, right? There's maybe ways in which I might be able to give you those expectations, and certainly in which you have those expectations without language at all. And so language is just, under their theory, meant to be like a very efficient and automatic way of activating those imagistic or semantic networks, right? And that's the sense in which for us as well, when I say how many tomatoes, should be activating sort of images of tomatoes, their distributional information. And so now when I'm showing you a number estimation task under intense time pressure, you should be sort of ideally relying on that information a little bit if it's already co-activated from the mere exposure to language. And again, in our work, we think that's not how it works. Like all that I gave you instructions to do is find the tomatoes and enumerate them. And that's all you're going to do. And you're not going to rely on any additional semantic information about the objects or their context.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.